Samuel Harris is, well, you know who he is. Neuroscientist, author, podcaster, meditation guru. He was once part of our beloved intellectual dark web, but Harris vehemently distanced himself from this moronic echo chamber after the events of January 6th. Harris managed to escape, but still kept some of the characteristics the group was lauded for in the first place. Being controversial, standing up against political correctness, and also saying the unsayable. Something like, the Jews are partly responsible for the Holocaust, which is what Sam has claimed in an interview on the Decoding the Gurus podcast, even though he phrased it slightly different. So before getting into the weeds, let's preemptively dissect the quote to prevent me from any accusations of taking him out of context.
I'm Jewish, right? I have written that the Jews are in part responsible for the Holocaust. How tribal is that? Now that's part of my denigration of belief of faith-based religion. It's like if the Jews defining themselves as Jews for 2,000 years, insisting upon living insular lives among communities that believe antithetical things about God, and thinking that it's important to marry within their community because of the profundity of their religious beliefs and their unique covenant with God. All of that divisive bullshit is part of the backdrop that gave us the centuries of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. So yeah, I'm someone who's made Judaism itself somewhat culpable in giving us the Holocaust.
So Harris mentions it's the religion they're devoted to, not the believers themselves who are at fault. Judaism is culpable. Quite the Weasley statement, since no matter how you spin it, Sam implicitly blames Jewish people. They choose to practice this harmful lifestyle after all. Also, saying stuff like part of and somewhat leave the extent of culpability open for discussion. Everyone is somewhat responsible for everything that happens to him, so that's a rather empty statement. Of course, Sam ascribes a rather big amount of responsibility to Jews. Why else would he present his statement as controversial to begin with? All in all, everything boils down to the following. Had the Jews chosen to assimilate, they wouldn't have been persecuted as much. Thus, they are partly responsible for the Holocaust. Let me show you why this is ahistorical bullshit. It's impossible to discuss the question by directly diving into National Socialism. So to connect the dots, we need to go even further back in time. After all, the NSDAP did not just suddenly decide to purge the Jews at a whim. No, the stereotypes that led Hitler to identify them as the central enemy date back roughly 800 years, and at that point were already based on some prior stigmata. We won't go as far as Moses, but one notable trigger for anti-Jewish feelings was the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem by the Muslims in 1009. A few decades later, the French monk Rudolphus claimed that Jews from Orléans in France urged the Caliph of Cairo to demolish the church, which led to the outbreak of anti-Jewish violence all over Europe. As you can see, there is an obvious parallel to the popular tale that Jews use Muslims to bring down Christianity. You'll recognize this pattern over and over again in the video. None of the anti-Semitic conspiracies propagated nowadays come from thin air. There's always historical continuity. The treatment of Jews in the aftermath of the church destruction served as an impetus for similar incidents during the First Crusade, the so-called Rhineland massacres. In 1095, Pope Urban II laid out the goals of the campaign in Clermont. Force back the Muslims from Byzantium, save the Christians in the east, and of course, free Jerusalem. Even though it wasn't directed at them, the preaching also inspired an outbreak of violence against Jews in France and especially the Rhineland, in the west of today's Germany. I mean, why travel for ages when there are some non-Christians basically right in your backyard? The popular conception of Jews as the Antichrist served as an convenient excuse to ransack their communities. While some crusaders were successfully bribed to spare them, numerous Jews got killed in the Rhineland. 10 to 11 in Speyer, 800 in Worms, and 1,100 in Mainz, which harbored one of the largest European Jewish communities. All in all, the massacres of 1096 claimed approximately 5,000 victims. David Nirenberg summarizes, "The events occupy a significant place in modern Jewish historiography and are often presented as the first instance of an anti-Semitism that would henceforth never be forgotten and whose climax was the Holocaust." 50 years after the First Crusade, it began to get even worse. In 1144, William, a 12-year-old skinner's apprentice, was found dead near Norwich. Even though his uncle and mother instantly accused Jews for his demise, they weren't taken seriously by the sheriff at that point. However, 5 years later, the monk Thomas of Monmouth started investigating the death and summarized his account of the crime in a book. His conclusions mainly rely on the testimony of Theobald of Cambridge, a converted Jew who claimed that William was murdered because of a European Jewish conspiracy. According to Theobald, the ancient writings of his fathers revealed that the Jews had planned to yearly sacrifice one Christian in some part of the world to reclaim the Holy Land. Needless to say, there are no sources for that claim. Even though there was no evidence, Thomas of Monmouth accordingly depicted William's death as a ritual murder and mirrored the crucifixion of Christ to stir up fear amongst the Catholics. Now the deed was done in this way, lest it should be discovered from the presence of nail marks in both hands and both feet that the murderers were Jews and not Christians, if eventually the body were found. They were not able to satisfy their heartless cruelty and their inborn hatred of the Christian name. Lo, after all these many and great tortures, they inflicted a frightful wound in his left side, reaching even to his inmost heart, and, as though to make an end of all, they extinguished his mortal life, so far as it was in their power. Quite frightening, right? In reality, there's no consensus about what happened to the boy till today, due to the lack of evidence. Still, the case of William marks the beginning of the ritual murder or blood libel myth. Accusations of child killing circulated. One absurd case occurred 1171 in Blois, France, when a Christian servant witnessed a Jewish man accidentally dropping animal skin into a water. After returning home, he claimed that the Jew had thrown a child's body in there. Even though a corpse was never discovered, the accusation alone led to the death of more than 30 Jews in the city. They were locked in a house, which was set on fire. In addition to killing, Jews were also said to serve the devil by desecrating the host. Weird stories were circulating. 1150 in Cologne, the son of a converted Jew was apparently seen taking home the wafer from Mass on Easter Sunday. He is said to have buried it in his garden. And after a priest opened the hole, the host assumed the shape of a child and miraculously floated to heaven. Sounds about right. Near Berlin in 1263 and in Brussels in 1320, many Jews were burned because of allegations like these. They added a cannibalistic element to the blood libel myth that spread rapidly all over Europe and was symptomatic of growing anti-Semitism. In addition to the horrible accusations, which already drew a wedge between Christians and Jews, constitutions were introduced at the Fourth Council of the Lateran, convoked by Pope Innocent III in Rome in 1215. 71 canons were recorded and afterwards circulated in law schools, and 4 of them dealt solemnly with Judaism. Canon 70 prevented converted Jews from returning to their former confession. Canon 69 prohibited them from taking public office, and Canon 67 prevented charging excessive interest when lending money. The 68th canon was the most significant one. It happens at times that, through error, Christians have relations with the women of Jews and Jews with Christian women. Therefore, that they may not, under pretext of error of this sort, excuse themselves in the future for the excesses of such prohibited intercourse, we decree that such Jews in every Christian province and at all times shall be marked off in the eyes of the public from other peoples through the character of their dress. Sam, what's going on here? Segregation laws instituted by a Christian institution? In the centuries after the council, countries introduced badges that mirror the yellow star of the Third Reich and several other elements to distinguish Jews from Christians. Even though not every country enforced the canons, Jewish-Catholic relations suffered heavily. As soon as they left their quarters, Jews were instantly identifiable and vulnerable. The markings, whether they were hats, badges, belts or collars, became a stigma and marginalized them, making assimilation more and more difficult. Frustration and hatred accelerated when the Black Plague spread and Jews functioned as perfect scapegoats for the misery that decimated over 20 million people. In 1348, the Jewish merchant Agiment of Geneva was arrested and confessed under torture that he poisoned the wells in Geneva, Toulouse, and near the Mediterranean Sea with a special powder. This almost certainly false confession led to pogroms all over Europe in 1349. In Basel, 50 to 70 Jews were burned. In Strasbourg, 900. A 2013 paper by Anderson, Johnson and Koyama analyzes the correlation between Jewish persecutions and weather shocks. They come to the conclusion that more developed states with greater fiscal capacity and greater political stability were less likely to expel Jewish communities as a result of periods of cold weather. Persecutions peaked in the 14th to 16th centuries. Jewish communities were most vulnerable to persecution in economically marginal communities in weak states. As frustration, desperation, and anger increased, Jews served as the perfect punching bag, because, well, they were a minority. Needless to say, the sequence of events as well as the results of the paper contradict Sam's theory of chosen insularity. Speaking of which, the most obvious element contributing to segregation were, of course, ghettos. And to make it short, no. Jews did not just choose to stay away from the Christians because they were so peculiar about their customs. Since ancient times, segregated Jewish districts were quite common in Europe, but Jews also lived among Christians and vice versa. Forced segregation then became more and more prevalent in the late Middle Ages. The most notorious ghetto was instituted in Venice in 1516. Merchant Jews had been working in the city since forever, but they were not allowed to spend the nights there. After heated negotiations, the Senate then granted them the right to move into the city, albeit in separated quarters. Now you might think, wait, at least the Christians allowed them to stay, right? Isn't that rather generous? Well, no. For example, the Roman ghetto in 1555 was established after the Pope revoked the rights of the Jewish community and justified it like this. It is completely senseless and inappropriate to be in a situation where Christian piety allows the Jews whose guilt, all of their own doing, has condemned them to eternal slavery, access to our society and even to live among us. Indeed, they are without gratitude to Christians, as instead of thanks for gracious treatment, they return invective, and among themselves, instead of the slavery which they deserve, they manage to claim superiority. They should at long last recognize their erroneous ways and should lose no time in seeing the true light of the Catholic faith. As you can see, it had nothing to do with what we call tolerance today. The city simply profited of the Jews and hoped to convert them. The cruelty of forced segregation becomes also apparent by the fact that, at night, the gates to the ghettos were closed, imprisoning the Jewish population. Also, well, they still had to wear the typical insignia as soon as they left the ghettos. Maybe you've watched an adaptation of The Merchant of Venice, where Al Pacino as Shylock is draped in a red garment. In Shakespeare's play, Shylock works as a moneylender, for a good reason. You see, after the First Crusade, Jews were excluded by Christian craft guilds and couldn't work in certain trades anymore. Since they were also prohibited from owning land, Jewish people were basically forced to work in non-conventional fields, especially money lending. Because taking interest was considered sinful by the Catholic Church, Jews were disproportionately represented in the trade and were also associated with usury and treachery. The conspiracy of Jewish high finance is rooted here. Jewish money even financed the rulers, who, when they realized they could never pay it back, often burned down Jewish houses, or even expelled them from the areas of influence. England banished them in 1290, the King of France followed in 1394 with the explicit intention of getting rid of the debt after the costly 7th Crusade. Austria followed in 1421, Spain in 1492, and Portugal in 1497, among others. There are lots of horrible stories in the aftermath of these expulsions. I could spend, for example, an hour talking about Martin Luther's relationship to the Jews, or take a look at how the Cossacks massacred them in the 17th century in today's Ukraine. But I think it has become clear that discrimination in the Middle Ages was not self-imposed by the Jewish communities, who insisted upon their isolation. True assimilation was simply impossible. And the same is true for National Socialism. While anti-Semitism had always been an innate part of German culture, it was dialed to 11 after the World Economic Crisis in 1929 and the shame of World War I, when the Nazis used the people's anxieties and distrust in democracy to rile them up against the Jews. In contrast to Sam's proposal though, Ironically, the Jews weren't feared for their otherness or because of their religion. In the Nazis' eyes, they were assimilating too much. Hitler states in Mein Kampf, "The ignorance of the broad masses about the inner nature of the Jew make the people an easy victim for this Jewish campaign of lies." Comparisons to sicknesses, such as tuberculosis, were an important part of NS language and imagery, indicating that a Jewish virus was slowly disseminating the so-called Volkskörper, the racial corpus, from the inside. Instead of an isolated fringe group, the NSDAP framed Jews as modern capitalists, waging a war against the conservative traditions of the German folk. A scary vision. In his comprehensive biography on Hitler, Ian Kershaw writes, "It was a hatred so profound that it could only have been based on deep fear. This was of a figure in his imagination so powerful that it was the force behind both international finance capital and Soviet communism. It was the image of a Jewish world conspiracy that was almost inconquerable, even for National Socialism." When the Nuremberg racial laws were enacted in 1935, elaborate charts, as well as procedures like nose measuring, make it obvious that effective discrimination was often impossible without pseudo-scientifically looking for elements to distinguish German from Jewish blood. They simply integrated too well. Also, it's not like only Jews were put into concentration camps. Socialists, other political enemies, gay people, etc. also suffered heavily from NS ideology, and none of them isolated themselves in a particular way. The lies and the stereotypes that had been looming all over Europe for millennia found their logical climax in the Holocaust. Jews existed. That's why Hitler killed them. All in all, Jewish hate over centuries was motivated by countless other factors and did not boil down to self-segregation. It needs to be said that even the consideration in this video to insinuate there's only one homogeneous Jewish people is basically problematic in itself. It was a diverse group, from urban to rural, more or less orthodox, more or less assimilated, and so on and so forth. Even if certain individuals and communities started to distrust non-Jewish people at some point, can you blame them? If you'd been subjected to hate and despair for over 2000 years, wouldn't you be careful and skeptic? Jesus, why do so many of these anti-mainstream thinkers fail miserably when talking about history? Sam might be intelligent in terms of neuroscience or meditation, but his urge to take on controversial stances has backfired several times, whether it's the bell curve or this whole shtick. I think this Jew Holocaust thing is just the result of atheist mental gymnastics in order to denigrate religion in general and somehow tie it to something awful. Judaism is a religion and consequently must entail horrible consequences. Another nice effect is that Sam uses the quote to emphasize that he is the oh so rational thinker, free of biases, you know? The most problematic aspect though is not Sam's historical illiteracy or his heterodox thinking for the sake of it, no, it's the victim blaming. A group that doesn't adhere to a certain norm which is completely arbitrary can thereby be considered guilty for discrimination. Gee, why did these damn Jews embrace their religion and not just convert, goddammit? They really must have had it coming. They were totally the only ones who were devoted to and claimed to serve the one and only, the best God. No other religion could compete with this arrogance. Oh, hey Sam, by the way, do you know which religion is said to have been rather tolerable of Judaism in the Middle Ages, especially compared to the Westerners? Huh? Can you guess? Yeah, it's the Muslims you hate so goddamn much. Maybe genociding wasn't so inevitable, after all. See you in 2022. Merry Christmas.